It was the year 9 AD. Rome, the supreme force of the known world, extended its legions over entire continents, dominating civilizations with its order, its steel, and its unbreakable will. Each order was a promise of conquest, each new land a testament to the inevitability of the empire. The Senate and the people of Rome walked like gods among mortals, and for them, destiny was a road paved with glory and war. But destiny is a capricious craftsman. Sometimes, it carves empires from marble and gold, other times, it dissolves them in blood and ashes. In the depths of the Germanic forests, where the pines rose like columns of a temple forgotten by the gods, where the ground was thick, damp, and treacherous, an army marched. They were the sons of Rome, iron men, trained from youth for war, for discipline, for absolute order. They were legions, living temples of the Roman war machine, and each of them believed they were on their way to yet another inevitable victory. Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania and commander of the expedition, rode his horse at the center of the column. His eye scanned the dense wall of trees, but he saw no danger. Varus was an administrator, a man of law, more accustomed to the corridors of palaces than to the treacherous trails of the Germanic jungle. For him, that march was not a campaign of war, but an act of reaffirmation. Rome was there to govern, to civilize, to impose order over chaos. And chaos was watching. Hidden among the shadows of the trees, concealed by the silence of the forest, thousands of eyes watched them. Men with painted skin, long hair, sharp spears. They knew the forest as Rome would never know it. They breathed its humidity, walked its soft earth without leaving traces, spoke with the wind, and listened to the branches crack under the heavy feet of the invaders. For the Germanic people, war was not a matter of formation and strategy. It was a whisper, a patient wait, a blade sliding silently across the enemy's throat. And Rome was not prepared. In the heart of that Roman column, among legionaries with shining armor and officers who believed they were patrolling a secure province, there was a different man. His name was Arminius. Born among the Cherusci, one of the Germanic tribes, he had been taken by Rome while still young. Raised as a Roman citizen, trained in the art of war, he had served in the legions and risen through the ranks, becoming a trusted ally of the Romans. But Arminius was not a true Roman. Within his chest beat a Germanic heart, and each pulse echoed the call of his land. He had learned the secrets of Roman warfare, not to serve Rome, but to destroy it. With calm words and false loyalty, he convinced Varus that some Germanic tribes were restless. It was necessary to march for a show of strength. A simple counsel, a suggested path, a decision that seemed harmless. But the road Varus chose was not just a shortcut, it was a corridor of death. The legions advanced unsuspectingly. The forest closed around them like a hungry mouth. The trails narrowed, the Roman shields no longer formed impenetrable walls, the precise formations began to disorganize. The sky became a mantle of shadows, and the silence of the forest turned into an invisible weight on the soldiers' shoulders. Then, it happened. A single scream echoed among the trees, a primal sound, laden with fury and vengeance. Arrows tore through the air, spears emerged from the shadows like the teeth of predators. The Romans looked around and saw no enemies, only trees and leaves, shadows and mist. But the enemy was there, everywhere. Chaos took over. The Germanic warriors emerged from nowhere, attacking, retreating, disappearing. The Romans tried to form their phalanxes, but the terrain was relentless. The Germanic spears found their targets before the shields could be raised. The legionaries fell, their heavy armor making them easy prey in that hell of roots and mud. For 3 days, the screams filled the forest. Varus's soldiers, who had once marched confidently, were now just trying to survive. There were no reinforcements, no clear orders, no way out. Every step they tried to take to escape led them deeper into the abyss. And then, like a macabre play, Rome fell. The last survivors were hunted down. The standards of the legions were torn down, trampled, stolen. The eagle of Rome, its symbol of power and glory, was taken by those it called barbarians. Publius Quinctilius Varus, surrounded, dishonored, chose the only path left to him. He plunged his sword into his own belly and fell upon the land he would never conquer. The forest swallowed Rome that night. What happened next? What did this defeat mean for the empire? How did the greatest power of antiquity react to such a crushing humiliation? Comment below. Do you believe that the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was a turning point in the history of the Roman Empire? If Rome had won, would the world today be different? Let's debate. If you've made it this far, it's because you feel that history is not just a recounting of the past, but a mirror reflecting the present and a beacon illuminating the future. What happened in the Teutoburg Forest was not just a lost battle, it was a lesson about strategy, arrogance, and the fragility of even the most powerful empire. And just as Rome found its limits, we all face moments when life presents us with relentless challenges. But here is the great truth: history teaches us that every defeat can be a turning point, and every obstacle can become the impetus for real transformation. Knowledge is the greatest weapon we can carry, and by being part of this community, you are not just watching a video, you are becoming an agent of this mission. If this story has impacted you, if it has awakened in you the desire to see beyond the obvious, then now is the time to act. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. It's not just a symbolic gesture, every click helps this message reach more people, aids this community in growing, and strengthens a movement of sharp minds passionate about knowledge. Together, we can bring to light the stories that change the world and, who knows, find within them the power to change our own lives. So, be part of this mission. History calls us, and the choice is in your hands. The 1st century AD was a period of ambition and conquest for Rome. The empire, already established as the greatest military power of the ancient world, stretched from the Atlantic to the Middle East, dominating vast territories and subjugating peoples under the shadow of the legionary eagles. With Gaul finally pacified after Julius Caesar's brutal campaigns, a new horizon opened for the Romans, the wild lands beyond the Rhine, a mysterious and untamed territory known as Germania. The Roman view of that region was mixed. On one hand, it was seen as a vast territory rich in natural resources and, above all, a potential new domain to be assimilated into the Roman order. On the other hand, Germania was not a province like the others. Unlike Gaul, which, despite its resistance, had a more centralized tribal structure, the Germans were a mosaic of fierce, independent tribes resistant to unification. The very climate and geography of the region were challenging. Dense forests, treacherous swamps, and a merciless winter created a hostile environment for an army accustomed to the well-paved roads and open plains of the Mediterranean. Still, Rome believed it could impose its will upon the Germanic barbarians. Since Caesar's time, military campaigns had attempted to consolidate a Roman presence in the region, but without definitive success. Roman generals faced difficulties in establishing stable governance, and despite some victories, they could not completely subjugate the Germanic warriors. The main barrier was the very decentralized nature of these tribes. Without a capital to conquer or a king to subjugate, Rome found itself fighting against an invisible enemy, who vanished into the shadows of the forests only to strike again when least expected. It was in this context that, in the year 7 AD, Publius Quinctilius Varus was appointed governor of Germania. He was not a renowned general, but rather an experienced administrator, chosen more for his political skill than for his military talent. His mission was clear: to transform Germania into a Roman province, implement the tax system, and consolidate imperial dominance over those peoples. For Augustus, the pacification of Germania was a strategic necessity. Not only for territorial expansion, but to ensure that the Rhine was not merely a defensive barrier, but the center of a new prosperous province. Varus arrived in Germania with the confidence that his name would bring order to that untamed land. His strategy was the same as Rome used in other territories: attract tribal leaders into alliances, offer citizenship and advantages to those who submitted, and crush any resistance with the might of his legions. However, what he did not understand was the depth of Germanic resistance. For many Romans, the barbarians were merely primitive tribes, incapable of challenging the discipline and power of the legions. But there was something Rome had not foreseen: a man who knew both worlds and would use Roman knowledge against the empire itself. This man was Arminius. Born among the Cherusci, one of the Germanic tribes living in the region between the Rhine and Elbe rivers, Arminius was taken to Rome at a young age, where he received education, military training, and citizenship. Raised among Romans, he learned their tactics, their strategies, and their way of governance. He fought alongside the legions, absorbing every detail of the Roman art of war and gaining the trust of his superiors. When he returned to Germania as an officer in the service of Rome, he was seen as a loyal ally, someone who could facilitate the integration of the Germans into the empire. But within Arminius burned a different spirit. He saw his land being slowly absorbed by Rome, its traditions threatened, its warriors being forced to submit to a foreign culture. In the eyes of the Romans, he was a faithful citizen; in the eyes of his own people, he was becoming a traitor. But Arminius had a plan. In secret, he began to gather tribal leaders, forming unlikely alliances among tribes that had historically been rivals. He knew that alone his people would stand no chance against Rome, but if all the tribes united under a single purpose, they could strike a blow that would echo through eternity. And the target of this trap would be none other than Varus. Varus trusted Arminius blindly. The Cherusci leader was his guide, his interpreter, his intermediary with the Germans. When Arminius suggested that some tribes were rebelling and that it would be necessary to march to quell this insurrection, Varus did not hesitate. He ordered 3 complete legions, about 20,000 soldiers, to march to demonstrate the strength of Rome. The chosen path? A narrow corridor amidst the dense Germanic forests. A territory where the rigid formations of the legions would be exposed. Where Roman discipline would lose its advantage, and where the battle would not take place in the open fields they were accustomed to, but rather in the bowels of a hostile land. Where the enemy did not need to win head-on, just to destroy gradually, in relentless and surgical attacks. Unbeknownst to him, Varus and his legions were marching toward one of the greatest disasters in the history of Rome. The cold wind whispered among the trees of the dense Teutoburg Forest, carrying with it the damp smell of the earth and the foreboding of something dark. The grey sky seemed to weigh down on the thousands of Roman soldiers who, in a long and slow march, advanced along the narrow, muddy trail. The clinking of armor, the dragging of shields against exhausted bodies, and the muffled sound of sandals hitting the ground formed a sinister melody, a hymn for the disaster that was approaching. They were about 20,000 experienced legionaries, barbarian auxiliaries, servants, and porters, all following the orders of Publius Quinctilius Varus. In front of them, leading with firmness and apparent conviction, was Arminius, the Cherusci officer, who pointed the way ahead with an expression that the Romans interpreted as unquestionable loyalty. The governor trusted him as he would trust any Roman commander. But at that moment, marching deeper into the green and damp labyrinth of Germania, Arminius was not a guide, he was an executioner leading the enemy to the gallows. The justification for that expedition seemed clear. Arminius had reported that Germanic tribes were rebelling, and that Rome could not allow the province to be threatened. He convinced Varus that the best way to deal with the situation would be to march directly to the heart of the revolt, crossing the forest to surprise the barbarians. For Varus, who did not know the terrain well and underestimated the organizational capacity of the Germans, the idea seemed good. Rome relied too much on the superiority of its legions. Centuries of battles had proven that Roman discipline, military structure, and armament were practically unbeatable against disorganized enemies. What Varus did not realize, or simply ignored, was that this blind confidence would be his ruin. As the march progressed, the environment began to become increasingly hostile. The wide and firm road that the Romans were used to had been left behind, giving way to narrow paths, surrounded by immense trees that blocked any view of what lay beyond them. The terrain was uneven, full of roots emerging from the ground like claws trying to grasp the soldiers' sandals. The mud made the steps heavy, requiring much greater effort to maintain the pace. And, worse still, the organized military formation, the great Roman advantage in combat, began to unravel. In the vast plains or roads built by Roman engineers, the legions marched in well-aligned ranks, protected by the rigor of discipline. But there, in the dense forest, the column of soldiers stretched for miles, broken into small groups disconnected from one another. The thick vegetation prevented commanders from seeing the extent of the troop, and communication between units became increasingly difficult. The weight of the armor was an additional problem. Each legionary carried not only his metal breastplate but also a rectangular shield, a gladius, and spears. Under the stifling heat of the forest, sweat dripped down their faces, and the humidity made each piece of equipment even heavier. The supply wagons and pack animals, which transported tents and provisions, struggled to move through the rugged terrain. Yet, the soldiers marched confidently. They were Romans, belonging to the greatest army in the world, and believed that no band of filthy barbarians could pose a real threat to them. Varus himself rode calmly, ignoring the first signs of alarm. Reports from scouts saying that something was amiss were dismissed. Small groups of Germanic warriors were spotted in the distance, but instead of attacking, they merely watched and vanished among the trees, like shadows stalking their prey. And then, when the Romans were completely immersed in the green labyrinth, the silence became deafening. The sounds of the forest, the songs of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, suddenly disappeared. The legionaries exchanged uneasy glances, adjusted the weight of their shields, tightened their fingers around the hilts of their swords. Something was wrong. And then, hell began. A scream sliced through the silence like a blade. Arrows and spears rained down from all sides, tearing into the soldiers' flesh before they even had time to raise their shields. Trees that seemed merely part of the landscape opened like curtains to reveal Germanic warriors emerging from camouflaged hideouts. Their eyes shining with fury and their bodies painted for war, the Romans tried to regroup, but there was no space to form their battle lines. The forest was a living trap, preventing any organization. What should have been an unbeatable army had become a jumble of soldiers trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The Germanic warriors attacked in waves, disappearing among the trees after each assault. The Romans were being hunted, one by one, unable to comprehend how such a well-trained army could be on the brink of collapse. The betrayal was complete. Arminius, who had marched with them up to that point, was no longer by the Roman side. He had joined his true people, leading the ambush that would annihilate Varus's legions. The triumphant march of the Roman Empire in Germania had turned into a desperate race for survival. The Teutoburg Forest, once merely a hostile and silent landscape, became a field of absolute horror. The air vibrated with the sharp sound of arrows slicing through tree branches, tearing flesh, piercing shields, and embedding themselves in the bodies of Roman soldiers. Screams of pain and terror echoed among the trees, muffling any commands the officers tried to give. Steel clanged against steel, the noise of blades meeting flesh and bone mingled with the sound of bodies falling heavily onto the mud and dry leaves. The Germanic warriors emerged from the shadows like demons of the forest. There was no order in their attacks, only fury and precision. Camouflaged by the environment, they advanced in small groups, striking and retreating before the Romans could even turn around. What was supposed to be an organized army had now become a mass of disoriented men, pushing against one another, unsure of where to run or how to defend themselves. The Roman armor, which once represented invulnerability on the battlefield, was now a deadly weight. The legionaries, accustomed to fighting in compact formations, found themselves completely vulnerable amidst the tight trees. Their large, rectangular shields, so effective against projectiles in open fields, became cumbersome there. Reduced visibility and slippery ground made every movement a struggle against the environment. On the other side, the Germans knew exactly how to fight in that terrain. They moved with speed and precision, using short spears and agile swords. They delivered precise blows before disappearing into the darkness of the trees. They attacked like predators hunting weakened prey, with a savagery that the Romans did not expect. Varus desperately tried to react. He shouted orders, but few were heard. The troops were scattered, disorganized, completely broken. The centurions tried to gather small groups of soldiers to form defensive barriers, but with each attempt, a new Germanic assault shattered any resistance. The situation was chaotic. Legionaries ran in all directions, some trying to regroup, others fleeing purely out of survival instinct. Panic began to spread. What had once been a confident march towards supposed victory transformed into sheer despair. Many soldiers dropped their weapons and shields, trying to escape through the forest. Others, wounded and powerless, fell to their knees, merely waiting for the enemy blade to end their suffering. And then came the worst part: it was not a battle. It was a massacre. The attack did not last just a few hours, it stretched over 3 days. 3 long and hellish days where the Romans were hunted without respite. Fatigue, fear, and hunger began to take hold, but the Germans gave them no rest. With each attempt at organization, a new attack. With each small advance, a new ambush. The bodies of legionaries fell upon their own comrades, forming piles of corpses that mingled with the blooded mud of the forest. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the man responsible for that expedition, watched helplessly as his army was completely destroyed. He, who had left Rome with the confidence of Emperor Augustus, who believed in the invincibility of his legions, now saw everything crumble. There were no reinforcements. There was no salvation. When Varus realized that his capture was inevitable, he made the only decision left to him: he chose death. Brandishing his own sword, he plunged the blade into his body, ending his life. His suicide was a final act of desperation and shame, but nothing changed the fate of his men. The few survivors, desperate to escape, ran aimlessly through the forest. Some tried to cross rivers, only to be caught by Germanic warriors who killed them mercilessly. Others tried to hide, but were hunted down one by one. There was no mercy. In the end, from an army of 20,000 soldiers, only handfuls of survivors managed to escape and eventually brought news of the tragedy back to Rome. News that would shake the heart of Augustus himself and forever change the history of the Roman Empire. The news of the disaster swept across the vast roads of the Roman Empire like distant thunder, gaining strength with each messenger who drew closer to Rome. When it finally reached the ears of Emperor Augustus, the reaction was one of pure despair. It is said that the emperor, consumed by a fury mixed with the deepest sorrow, struck his head against the walls of his palace. Incessantly repeating the same phrase, "Varus, give me back my legions." But Varus was dead. His legions were dead. The names 17, 18, and 19 would never again be spoken without carrying the weight of defeat. None of those legions would be rebuilt, a symbolic act, a mark of eternal shame for Rome. The catastrophe at Teutoburg shattered the confidence of the empire in an irreparable way. For the first time in centuries, Rome did not seem invincible. Its enemies realized that beneath the shining armor and disciplined formations, there were weaknesses. The legend of Roman supremacy was shattered in the heart of that damp, dark forest. Germania, which once seemed a territory to be absorbed by the inexorable growth of the empire, became a nightmare. Rome would never dare to confront Germania in the same way. The political repercussions were immediate. The Senate and the Roman people, accustomed to victories, reacted with shock and fear. If 3 entire legions could be wiped from existence in just a few days, what was to stop the barbarians from invading the very borders of Rome? Fear spread, and Augustus was forced to reinforce the defenses. The remaining legions along the Rhine were ordered to fortify themselves, building stronger fortifications, deepening trenches, increasing patrols. Rome would not make the mistake of underestimating the Germans again. The expansion beyond the Rhine was abandoned. The dream of turning Germania into a Roman province died in those blood-soaked forests. Unlike Gaul, which succumbed to Roman strength and was integrated into the empire, Germania would remain wild, a territory that Rome recognized as untamable. Thus, the Rhine frontier became one of the definitive limits of the empire. But if Rome suffered, the Germans thrived. Arminius's victory became a symbol of resistance, a feat that unified the Germanic tribes and strengthened their identity. For the first time, these tribes realized that together they were capable of facing the greatest empire in the world and winning. This spirit of Germanic independence would shape future events in Europe, serving as inspiration for other peoples wishing to free themselves from foreign oppression. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was much more than a military defeat for Rome. It was a turning point in the history of humanity. It showed that even the most powerful war machine of its time had its limits. It proved that the fate of an empire was not written solely by the strength of its arms, but also by the traps of pride and blind confidence. And, above all, it revealed that history itself can be transformed by those who refuse to submit. Even the most powerful empire in history had its limits. The Teutoburg Forest proved that Rome was not invincible. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was not just a clash between Romans and Germans. It was a warning. A reminder that even the grandest empires can fall, not through a head-on collision with a superior enemy, but through their own arrogance, through a false sense of invincibility. Rome, which until then marched unopposed through the known world, found its limit where it least expected, in the darkness of a treacherous forest, under the silent gaze of enemies who patiently awaited the right moment to strike. And if this happened to Rome, what prevents it from happening to any other empire? What prevents blind confidence, the illusion of absolute control, from leading even the most powerful nations of today to a similar fate? The fall can come when least expected, not on a grand battlefield, but where the eyes cannot reach, where security seems guaranteed, where a single mistake is enough to destroy centuries of supremacy. History teaches us that no power lasts forever. But are we listening? Or are we, like Rome, marching blindly toward our own Teutoburg Forest? Leave your comment below and like, and also subscribe to the channel. Until the next video.